You're listening to Kennesaw State University's Atlanta Student Movement podcast, where we share untold stories of Atlanta's role in the struggle for civil rights. These stories give voice to unsung heroes who stood up against segregation in a city at war with itself, in a city that started a movement.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Atlanta Student Movement podcast, October 19th, Richard sit-ins. Here with me are James Lee.
Hello.
And Eric Merriweather.
Howdy.
Well, let's get started.
So October 19th was a tipping point for the civil rights movement in Atlanta. Hundreds of students from Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Morris Brown, and Atlanta University all united together to launch their most known sit-in at Rich's department store, Atlanta's largest retailer at the time.
The students actually requested for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to join them that day in hopes to increase the publicity of the protest. After some persuasion and a passionate pleas from movement leader Lonnie King the night before, he agreed, and this is when the students set their protest in motion.
One of the most important strategies these students implemented was jail no bail, where they would refuse bail. The point of this was to crowd the jailhouses, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the many arrested. The richest sit-ins marked the first time Dr. King went to jail voluntarily for nonviolent protests.
So what do you guys think, being that we're students that were about their ages at the time, what do you think it would be like as a young student in a movement like this?
I think it's actually kind of scary because reflecting on a little protest I participated in about 6 months ago, it's very nerve-wracking because you're protesting what older people than you are saying is right, is how it should be. And so it's kind of scary because police are out there and, you don't know what people are going to do. So it's very nerve-wracking.
Yeah, in a protest nowadays, there's a lot of things. It's low stakes in some cases, but especially being a person protesting desegregation and racial discrimination back then, it's scarier. It's almost like back then, especially when you got arrested, there was no human rights, and I can't even imagine going through something like that.
Yeah, it's such a different circumstance. Like, it's crazy because, being our ages, none of us have grown up in that. It's like we've kind of been insulated completely from that world that they lived in. Mm-hmm. But thinking about the fact that there are still people alive who went through that, and it's crazy to think that we, if they hadn't done what they did, that our state could still be that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So. Switching gears a little bit and going back to talking about Rich's, which of course was the largest department store in Atlanta at the time, people even traveling from outside of the state to shop there. Rich's accounted for 38% of all retail sales in the South. Dr. Lonnie King even called it the big kahuna of stores.
Yeah, Marilyn Pryce Hoyt, seen in this iconic photo of students being arrested that day, discusses in her oral history how her family would travel via train from Tuskegee, Alabama, just to shop there.
And the significance of the boycotts and sit-ins is clear because sales for Rich's declined by 13% by the end of 1960 following the sit-ins. This decline can be attributed to the financial pressure caused by the sit-ins and also other businesses in the Atlanta area willing to compromise their prejudice policies.
So after the boycotts, Rich's actually negotiated with the students to desegregate its lunch counters. During the winter of 1960 to 1961, Rich's lost almost $10 million in revenue, which translates today into hundreds of millions of dollars.
Economists have studied this phenomenon, and they agree that this loss is what brought store management to the bargaining table in the spring of 1961. That following fall, the fall of 1961, the lunch counters were finally integrated.
So, right before we go, did either of you guys have any closing thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Hey, let me go first.
Yeah, you go first.
So, it's crazy to see the impact that these peaceful protests had. Because I think a lot of stuff that happens right now, it's pretty aggressive. And I think for some reason people think being more angry means you're more right, but I think we can learn from history that something planned well and done very peacefully can have huge impact.
Great. I was just thinking that if it's such a big store like Rich's, I mean, why should it be segregated? So I'm glad all that stuff was fixed. I don't understand the whole idea of segregation. It just doesn't make sense. So I'm glad things are turned around now.
Yeah, so back to your point, I thought it was just really interesting how these students, people who are about our ages, how they got together and they created this document, this outline of what they wanted accomplished, and they got together and they did it. And that's not something that I've ever seen people do. You know, people get together nowadays and they get violent, to your point, and they do all these things, but they don't actually accomplish anything, because and this student movement was sort of a model of how, when you believe and you stand for something, how you get together and how you actually make it happen. And because of them, we're able to not have to be raised in the same type of environment that many of our grandparents and stuff like that were raised in. And I just think that's really cool.
All right, that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening to our episode 2. Episode 3 will be about the Spelman ladies in jail, February 1961. Thank you. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Kennesaw State University's Atlanta Student Movement podcast. For more information, check out our podcast homepage for details on the project and how you can contact us. Thanks for listening.